There is a moment, you may not remember exactly when it happened, but you know it happened when something in you got quiet. Not peaceful quiet, the other kind, the kind where you stopped expecting things to get better and started just managing, getting through Tuesday so you could get through Wednesday, sleeping but not resting, smiling in photographs but somewhere behind your own eyes, watching yourself do it like a stranger. I want to talk to you about that moment tonight, because I think you're closer to the end of it than you believe. Every one of us carries a private mythology of our own suffering. We tell ourselves the story of the hard years, the ones where we lost the job, or the marriage, or the parent, or the version of ourselves we thought we'd become by now. And there is a strange thing that happens to a mind in the middle of a long difficulty. It starts to believe the difficulty is the address it lives at. Not a place it's passing through, a place it's from. This is the first thing I want you to understand, and understand clearly, because it will matter later. Pain does not tell time. It has no calendar. When you are inside a hard season, it feels eternal. Not because it is eternal, but because pain, by its nature, erases your memory of ever being without it, and blinds you to any evidence that it might end. This is not weakness. This is not failure of imagination. This is simply what pain does. It is a room with no windows, and from inside it you cannot see the door you came in through, let alone the one you'll walk out of. But here is what nobody tells you about endings. They rarely arrive the way you'd expect, like a curtain falling, like a trumpet sounding, like the sky cracking open to announce that the trial is over. No, endings are quiet. Endings sneak in through the back. And this is precisely why so many people miss their own healing. They were watching the front door for a parade, while relief was already letting itself in through the kitchen. Think about the last time something in you actually shifted. A grief that finally loosened its grip. A fear that used to run your whole day, and one morning simply didn't. Did it come with fireworks? Or did you only notice, weeks later, looking back, that somewhere in the in-between, without ceremony, without warning, you had already crossed over? That is what is happening to you now. I want to say something that might sound strange, coming from a stage in front of all these lights. The very fact that you are here, that you sought this out, that some part of you reached for these words tonight is not an accident, and it is not neutral. Human beings do not go looking for meaning when they are comfortable. We go looking for meaning when the old meaning has stopped working, when the story we've been telling ourselves has finally run out of road. So let me ask you honestly, not rhetorically, but honestly, the way you'd ask a friend at 2 in the morning, what if this discomfort you've been carrying isn't a sign that something is wrong with you? What if it's the exact opposite? What if it's the sound of an old self finishing its work? Because here is a truth about human transformation that is almost never spoken plainly. You do not become someone new while everything feels fine. Growth, real growth, the kind that changes the architecture of who you are, requires a demolition first. Not because the universe is cruel, but because you cannot build a taller house on the same foundation. Something has to come down before something better can rise, and demolition, by definition, is loud and dusty and looks, from the inside, indistinguishable from destruction. This is the great confusion of every difficult season. It feels identical to an ending, because it is one. You are simply mistaking the ending of a version of you for the ending of you. I've watched this pattern in people my whole life, and if I'm honest, I've watched it in myself. We resist the very discomfort that is trying to move us forward, because comfort has convinced us it's the goal. But comfort was never the goal. Comfort is just the anesthesia we reach for when we're not ready to feel the truth. Growth, on the other hand, growth is not comfortable. Growth is a season where your old identity, the one built out of other people's expectations, out of fear, out of the small, careful compromises you made just to survive, that identity has to loosen its grip plank by plank before the new one can take its place. So what does it feel like, this ending, right before it completes? It feels like exhaustion with no clear cause. It feels like a restlessness that makes you want to burn your whole life down and start over, even though nothing catastrophic has technically happened. It feels like grief for a future you haven't even lost yet, just sensed somewhere underneath that you were about to outgrow it. It feels like asking yourself quietly in the car, in the shower at 3 a.m., is this really it? Is this really all there is? That question is not a crisis. That question is a doorway. Every myth humanity has ever told itself, the hero descending into the underworld, the prophet fasting in the desert, the phoenix required to burn completely before it can rise, every one of these stories exists because some ancient part of us already understood what modern life keeps forgetting. Transformation is always preceded by a kind of death. Not a literal one, a death of the self that can no longer carry you where you need to go. And the tragedy, the real tragedy, is not that people go through this. Everyone goes through this. The tragedy is how many people mistake the demolition for the diagnosis. They feel the ending of an old identity and they conclude, something is wrong with me, when the truer sentence would be, something is finally becoming right in me and it hurts because it is real. I want you to hold on to that distinction because it will change how you interpret every hard month for the rest of your life. Let me tell you something about time and about how it actually works inside a human life, not the way a clock measures it, but the way a soul does. There is a peculiar mercy built into suffering, one you can only see in hindsight. It has a shelf life. Not because the universe promises fairness, it doesn't, and anyone who tells you it does is selling you something, but because human beings are not designed to sustain any single emotional state indefinitely. Grief evolves. Fear exhausts itself. Even shame, given enough honest attention, eventually loosens. The nervous system, whatever it is going through, is always quietly in the background working toward equilibrium. You are not broken machinery. You are a self-correcting system that has been under unusual load. This is why the appearance of this exact moment in your life, this conversation, this stage, these words landing on you tonight of all nights, is not coincidence in the mystical sense. It's coincidence in the psychological sense, which is actually more remarkable. You were ready to hear this because the old chapter had already done almost all its work. The last mile of an ending is often the most silent. It's the point right before the sun rises, when the dark looks, paradoxically, its absolute deepest. Not because night is winning, because night is almost finished, and it has nothing left to spend but its last shadow. So if the last few months or years have felt like the heaviest of your life, I want to offer you a reframe, not as comfort, but as fact. The hardest phase of a story is disproportionately concentrated near its ending, not the middle, not the beginning, the end. Because the end is where the old self makes its final stand. It fights hardest right before it loses, the way a fire burns brightest right before it runs out of fuel. You are not regressing, you are finishing. Now, I won't stand here and tell you that once this ends, life becomes easy, or that pain retires permanently, because that would be a lie, and I promised you truth, not comfort. New chapters bring their own weather. But here is what does change, and it is not small. You change. The person who walks out of this season is not the same person who walked in. You will carry a kind of quiet competence that cannot be taught, only earned, the specific hard, one knowledge that you have survived something you once believed would end you. And that knowledge doesn't fade. It becomes the floor you stand on for everything that comes next. There's an old idea, you'll find it in a dozen traditions, wearing a dozen different names, that says, you are not punished for your suffering, you are prepared by it. I don't think that means suffering is good, or that it should be sought out or romanticized on a stage under warm lighting. I think it means something more modest and more useful, that pain, metabolized honestly, becomes capacity. The exact places where you were broken open become, over time, the places where you are unusually strong, not because the wound was good, but because you did the work of healing it, and that work leaves behind a kind of scar tissue that doesn't just protect you, it widens you. It lets you hold more empathy, more patience, more perspective than the person you were before the wound existed. So here, finally, is the revelation I want to leave you with tonight, the one thing I hope you take out of this room and carry into whatever is next. The reason this moment found you, the reason you're sitting here, in this exact chapter, hearing these exact words, is not because you are stuck. It's because you are almost through. Every ending disguises itself as a collapse right before it reveals itself as a threshold. You have not been failing, you have been finishing. And the discomfort you've been carrying is not evidence that you are lost. It is evidence that something in you has outgrown the life it used to fit into, and is, even now, quietly, without asking. Your permission, becoming someone new. The hardest phase of your life is ending. That is not a hope I am handing you. That is a pattern older than memory, older than any single life, playing out again in you right now. So the only question left, the only one that matters, is this. When the door finally opens, and it will you recognize that you're the one who opened it? Pain has a peculiar gift for making itself feel permanent, and it is worth sitting with exactly how it accomplishes that, because once you see the mechanism, you can never again mistake it for truth. Think about the last time you were in real difficulty, not a bad afternoon, but a season of it. Somewhere inside that season, a strange kind of amnesia set in. You could remember, intellectually, that there had once been a time before this. You could recall, as a fact, that you used to sleep easily, that you used to laugh without calculating the cost of it first. But you couldn't feel that time anymore. It had become information rather than memory, something you knew happened to you, the way you know a fact about a stranger's life. And this is the first trick pain plays. It doesn't just occupy the present, it colonizes your access to the past. It convinces the nervous system that ease was a rumor, not a lived experience. The second trick is worse. Pain doesn't only erase the past, it forecloses the future. Ask anyone in the middle of real suffering to imagine in detail a Tuesday 6 months from now where they feel light and unburdened, and watch what happens. Most people cannot do it, not because they lack imagination, but because pain has a way of collapsing the horizon until there is no later, to picture only an endless thickening now. This is not a character flaw. It is what happens to a mind under sustained pressure. The aperture narrows. You stop being able to see the walls of the room, because the room has become the whole of your vision. And this is why I call it a room with no windows. Not because there's no way out, there always is, but because asterisk from inside it, the eggs, it is architecturally invisible. Asterisk, you cannot see a door in a wall, you cannot even perceive as a wall. Everything simply looks like the world, permanent, total, the way water looks like the whole ocean to a fish who has never known air. I want you to notice something about this, though, because it is the part almost no one names out loud. The very completeness of that blindness is evidence of how deeply you were living inside the difficulty, not evidence that the difficulty was, in fact, endless. A prisoner who cannot see the door is still, undeniably, a prisoner in a room that has one. The blindness is a symptom of proximity, not a proof of infinity. You were too close to see the frame. That is all, that has always been all. So when you look back, and one day, not too far from now, you will look back, you will be startled by how ordinary the exit turns out to have been. Not a trumpet, not a sunrise breaking through stone. Probably something almost embarrassingly small, a conversation, a Tuesday morning, a sentence someone said to you that you happened to actually hear. That smallness will feel, at first, like it cheapens everything you went through. It doesn't. It simply tells you what was true the entire time you were inside that windowless room, that the wall was never as solid as it looked, and the door, unbeknownst to you, had been there all along. There is a very specific kind of confusion that happens in the middle of a hard season, and it deserves to be named plainly, because almost no one names it while it's happening, they only see it. Afterward, in hindsight, when the fog has cleared enough to look back and laugh, or wince, at how thoroughly they misread their own experience. Here is the confusion when an old identity begins to end, when the version of you that was built out of fear, or out of other people's expectations, or out of some early survival strategy you adopted so long ago you forgot it was a strategy at all. When that version of you starts to come apart, it does not feel like a self-ending. It feels like the self-ending. It feels total. It feels like erasure. And so the mind, doing what minds do, reaches for the nearest explanation, and the nearest explanation is almost always the wrong one. Something is wrong with me. I am failing, I am disappearing. But look closer at what is actually happening in those moments, because the texture of it is different from what panic tells you it is. Notice what specifically feels like it's dying. Is it your capacity to love people? Rarely. Is it your ability to notice beauty or tell the truth or feel curiosity about a stranger's life? Almost never. What is usually dying is much narrower than that. A role you'd been playing, a story about who you were supposed to become, a set of rules you inherited before you were old enough to question them. The peacekeeper who exhausted herself keeping a peace that was never hers to keep. The achiever who built a whole architecture of worth out of other people's approval, and finally, expensively, ran out of foundation. These are constructions, they are not you, and constructions, unlike selves, are allowed to fall. This is the distinction that almost never gets made clearly enough, and it matters more than almost anything else I could tell you tonight. Identity has layers, and only the outer ones are meant to be temporary. The part of you that observes your own suffering, that questions whether this is really all there is, that reaches for something better even in the middle of not knowing what that something is. That part is not eroding, that part is the very thing doing the noticing, and a thing cannot dissolve while it is busy watching itself dissolve. The observer survives every collapse it observes. That has always been the tell. So the next time something in you feels like it is ending, and something will, because that is simply what growth requires, ask a more precise question than the one panic hands you. Don't ask, am I falling apart? Ask, which part of me is falling apart, and was it ever really me, or was it just the coat I was wearing when the weather was different? Most of the time, when you actually sit with that question instead of running from it, you'll find the same answer waiting. It was a coat. It was useful once. It kept you warm through a winter you didn't choose, but you are not the coat, and you never were, and a person taking off a coat that no longer fits the season is not vanishing. They are simply finally dressing for the weather they're actually in. There's an image worth sitting with slowly, because it explains something about growth that most people only understand in hindsight, usually while standing in the wreckage of a life they didn't expect to have to rebuild. You cannot add a second story to a house whose foundation was only ever poured to hold one. Sooner or later, if the house is going to grow at all, the foundation itself has to be broken up and reset. Not because the builder was careless, because the original foundation was built for a smaller life, and the life outgrew it. This is what happens, quietly, underneath every difficult season that actually changes a person. Somewhere below the surface of the sleepless nights and the unexplained exhaustion, and the sense that everything is suddenly harder than it should be, something structural is being redone. The beliefs that held you up when you were 20 are being tested against a version of you that is no longer 20. The coping mechanisms that got a frightened younger self through a frightened younger life are being asked to carry weight they were never engineered for. And when a foundation like that finally gives, when the old belief about your worth, or your safety, or your place in the world, finally cracks under the load of who you're becoming, it does not feel like renovation, it feels like collapse. There is dust, there is noise, there is, very often, a period where nothing feels stable, because for a while, quite literally, nothing is. This is the part almost nobody prepares you for. Demolition is not a side effect of growth that we could skip if we were just smarter, or stronger, or more spiritually evolved. Demolition is the growth, or at least the first and least glamorous half of it. You do not get to keep the old identity intact and simply build improvements on top of it, the way you might add a room onto a house that was already sound. Some identities are sound. Most of the time, especially in the seasons that hurt the most, they are not. They were assembled quickly out of whatever materials were available at the time. A parent's expectations, a culture's definition of success, a heartbreak that taught you to protect yourself in a way that made sense once and calcified into something smaller than you. And a foundation built out of borrowed material eventually has to be poured again in your own name, out of what you've actually learned rather than what you were simply handed. What makes this bearable, what makes it survivable rather than merely destructive, is understanding that the mess is not evidence of failure. Contractors will tell you, a demolition site always looks worse before it looks better. There is a specific, ugly middle phase in every real renovation where the structure is exposed, the old walls are gone, and the new ones aren't up yet, and anyone walking past would assume the whole project had gone wrong. That phase is not a detour from the plan. It is the plan at the exact point where it is most necessary and least photogenic. So if some part of your life currently feels exposed in that way, like the old walls came down faster than the new ones went up, like you can see straight through to the frame of who you used to be without yet feeling settled into who you're becoming, that discomfort is not proof that the renovation failed. It is proof that it started. Nothing gets rebuilt taller without first being allowed to come down to the studs, and no one has ever built a life that could hold more by refusing to let the smaller one go. There is a detail about darkness that almost everyone misreads, and it happens to be one of the most reliable facts about how difficulty actually behaves over time. It does not increase steadily and then stop. It builds unevenly toward a peak that arrives disproportionately close to the very end, and that peak is so intense, so seemingly conclusive, that it convinces people the difficulty has become permanent at the exact moment it is nearest to finishing. Anyone who has stayed awake until the edge of morning knows this in their body, even if they've never put words to it. The deepest cold of the night does not come at midnight, when the sun has been gone the longest, gathering strength for its absence. It comes just before dawn, in the last stretch before light returns, when the accumulated cold of the whole night finally reaches its lowest point. And there is a cruel, almost comic irony in this, because it means the exact moment the darkness feels most total is the same moment the sun is closest to rising. If you didn't know that pattern, you would swear, standing in that particular cold, that morning had abandoned you for good. You would have every sensory reason to believe it, and you would be wrong, in the most understandable way a person can be wrong. Human difficulty follows something close to this same shape, and once you've seen it in your own life a few times, you start to recognize it happening to other people before they can see it themselves. The final stretch of a hard season is rarely gentle. It is often the loudest, most destabilizing part of the entire ordeal, the point where an old identity, sensing that its time is nearly up, does not go quietly. It argues. It produces its most convincing fears right when it has the least time left to be believed. This is not the universe testing your endurance for sport. It's closer to something mechanical, an old pattern spending its last reserves precisely because they are its last reserves. A fire does not dim gradually into embers. It very often flares, briefly and violently, right as it consumes the last of its fuel. That flare can look, from the outside, exactly like the fire growing. It is not growing, it is finishing. This is why so many people give up in exactly the wrong place, not at the beginning of a difficulty when they are fresh and undamaged, but near its ending when they are most depleted and the noise is loudest and every signal seems to confirm that nothing is improving. It is the cruelest timing possible, and also, strangely, the most common. The last mile asks the most of you precisely because it has the least distance left in which to ask it. So if you find yourself in a stretch that feels harder than anything that came before it, if the last few weeks or months have felt disproportionately heavy compared to the years that preceded them, consider the possibility that you are not regressing into a worse version of the difficulty. You may simply be standing in its final concentration. The old cold gathering everything it has left right at the hour before light. There is no way to verify this from inside the dark itself. That is precisely what makes it dark. But the pattern holds with remarkable consistency across every honest account of human struggle ever recorded. In every tradition that has bothered to write down what surviving something actually looks like from the inside, the hardest hour is rarely the middle. It is, disproportionately, almost always the one right before things change. There is a difference, rarely spoken about with any precision, between a wound and a scar, and almost everything about whether suffering ends up shrinking a person or enlarging them depends on understanding that difference. A wound, left as it is unexamined, unspoken, simply endured, and then buried under the next demand of daily life, tends to calcify into something smaller than the person who carries it. It becomes a rule. Never trust that much again. Never need anyone that visibly. Never let yourself hope out loud. These rules feel at the time like protection, and in the narrowest sense they are. But protection bought at the price of contraction is still contraction. A person governed entirely by their unexamined wounds does not become stronger from what happened to them. They become smaller, more guarded, more efficient at avoiding a repeat of a very specific pain at the cost of being available to almost everything else life might offer. This is suffering that was survived but never metabolized. It stays raw, indefinitely, just below a scar tissue, thin enough to reopen at the slightest provocation. But there is another outcome, and it is not automatic, and it is not guaranteed simply by the passage of time. It requires something deliberate, something closer to labor than to luck. When a wound is actually faced, named honestly, felt fully, understood rather than merely endured, something different happens to it. It doesn't just close, it becomes, oddly, a kind of instrument. The exact place where you once broke becomes unusually sensitive, in the way an old injury can make a person able to read a storm coming in their bones before anyone else feels the change in the air. Someone who has genuinely worked through grief develops an ability to sit with another person's grief without flinching from it, without rushing to fix it, without needing it to resolve quickly for their own comfort, an ability that people who have never been broken open in that particular way simply do not have, no matter how kind or well-intentioned they are. Compassion of that depth is not distributed randomly. It is, almost always, forged. This is what I mean when I say a wound, properly metabolized, becomes capacity rather than merely scar tissue. Capacity is not the absence of the old pain. The memory stays. What changes is what the memory is now capable of holding. A person who has been through real financial ruin and worked honestly through the shame of it often develops a kind of steadiness around money and failure that people who have never faced it can only imitate. Person who has survived a betrayal and actually done the work of understanding it, rather than simply hardening around it, often becomes remarkably difficult to fool a second time, not because they trust less, but because they read people more accurately. The wound taught them something the easy years never could have. None of this is an argument for seeking out suffering, or romanticizing it, or telling someone in the middle of real pain that it's secretly a gift. It very often does not feel like a gift, and it shouldn't be made to perform as one. But it is an argument for what happens after, for the quiet, unglamorous, entirely voluntary work of actually looking at what broke you instead of stepping around it. Because the people who do that work rarely end up merely recovered. They end up in some specific and hard, one way larger than they were before, not despite the wound, but through the particular, deliberate honesty of having gone all the way into it. There is a particular moment, near the end of almost every real transformation, when a person looks back at the door they just walked through and realizes something that unsettles them more than difficulty itself ever did. No one opened that door for them, they opened it. And somehow, in the middle of the hardest stretch of the whole ordeal, they had genuinely believed otherwise. This is worth examining closely, because it explains a strange gap that shows up again and again in how people describe their own turning points. Ask someone who has come through a long illness or a divorce or a collapse of some kind to describe the moment things started to change, and they will often reach for language that removed themselves from the sentence entirely. Something shifted. It just clicked one day. I don't know what happened, but suddenly things felt different. Asterisk passive constructions, every one of them, as though healing were weather that happened to arrive, rather than a door that required a hand on it turning, and there's a reason for that grammar, and it isn't modesty. In the depth of real difficulty, a person's sense of agency is often the very first thing to go dark. When you are exhausted enough, frightened enough, worn down by enough consecutive disappointments, you stop experiencing yourself as someone who asterisk does asterisk things and start experiencing yourself as someone things are asterisk done to asterisk. This isn't a character flaw either, it's closer to a defense mechanism, a way of surviving a period when taking full responsibility for your own rescue would simply be too heavy a weight to add to everything else you were already carrying. So the mind quietly outsources the credit. It waits for luck or time or someone else to be the one who finally opens the door, because believing you might have to open it yourself while you're still standing in the dark is sometimes more than a person can bear to consider. But look again at what actually happened in almost every account once you strip away that passive language. The conversation that changed everything, you were the one who picked up the phone. The morning you finally got out of bed, and did the one small necessary thing you'd been avoiding for months. No one did that for you. Something in you decided, that specific morning, that it was time. Even the moments that felt purely like luck on closer inspection usually turn out to have required you to be somewhere, doing something, having already made some quiet decision that put you in path of the thing that changed everything. Luck rarely operates on people who have made no motion whatsoever. It tends to find people already in motion and simply gives their motion somewhere useful to land. This is not a small correction. It is, in fact, the difference between walking away from this feeling, merely relieved, and walking away from it changed. If you believe the door opened on its own, you learn nothing you can use the next time a door needs opening. You're left waiting, again, for the same unpredictable mercy to arrive a second time. But if you can bring yourself to look honestly at your own hand on that handle, however small the motion felt in the moment, however uncertain you were while making it, you walk away with something that cannot be taken from you again, the knowledge that you are, in fact, the kind of person who opens doors. Not because you're fearless, because you did it while frightened, which is the only way it was ever actually going to happen.